Please welcome Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg.
That was way too nice.
Thank you. I could watch that again.
Well, we can.
I'd rather talk about your success over the last decade running the Cleveland Clinic.
Well, thanks. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks like it's
you're on the hot spot tonight.
really,
I'm
really
sorry.
well, Toby.
You're the largest employer in Ohio.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it?
And you've managed to fund all this from operations. You're going to change education for doctors, the expansion of the impact on the Midwest. And now you're global.
And we do Windows.
And you're googly. You do things free. Free is a good price.
We do that. Here they all are.
They're all here for free.
Yeah. Well, listen, I want you to know that I can see I got a control problem here today. This is not like the operating room.
I've known you for a decade, and I've known him for 13.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, one more compliment. We were observing that we're in the medical community, and the great thing about doctors is that they start on time and they own the outcome.
Well,
right? Right. So for those of you, it's actually like really hard to do. It's very impressive, all of you.
Thank you. I had the nice opportunity to read your book all the way through over this last weekend. And I want to tell all of you, if you haven't bought it, this is a plug. This is the advertising that pays for their trip. That it is a very worthwhile read. I sat down and read it straight through one read. And I want to thank you. And I realize that both of you were really seasoned executives. And you came from different organizations. When did you realize that you weren't in Kansas anymore?
There were a lot of early signs, but I think we missed them. I think for me, I showed up, and I'm kind of figuring it out, and the company is very small. And maybe a month or two after I started, I come into work, and I have a tiny little office, an 8-foot by 12-foot office, and there's a person in it who's working. He's moved his desk in, and I said, hello. He said, hello, I'm Amit. And I roughly said, what are you doing here?
How did you say it?
Like, roughly, in a nice way. I was like shocked. And he said, I've moved in. And I said, okay. And he said, well, and I paused, and he said, well, my office is over there, and it's really, really crowded, and you're never here. Now, it occurred to me...
This gives me a pause, by the way, for tomorrow morning.
So at this point, I realized that there's no possible thing I can now say. Anything I say is like bad, like get out of my office, or who the hell are you, or one of those things. So I had no choice but to sit down at my desk next to him.
How'd you guys get on?
Well, it was interesting that he's an engineer, and so he didn't say anything, and he was programming, and he had his headphones on, so I didn't have to talk to him at all. So about a month later, I'm talking to Amit, 2 months later, I'm talking to Amit, who's running sales. And, and I'm having this conversation, and it's, look, I think the number needs to be higher. And he says, no, it's a stretch goal. We're trying to get to 120, referring to $1 million of revenue. And I said, I'm sure that you can do higher. I've been looking at the growth rates. And he goes, yeah, we're going to try for 122. I click up the phone, and he takes his headphones off and says, do you need to know the revenue number? And I said, I knew you were listening in on all my conversations. I knew it. I knew you were sitting here listening. So it turns out that his job was to model revenue in the analytics department. So I never told anyone, and I just tortured the salespeople because I had the scientist next to me.
Right.
So what I learned a bit from this, aside from being just sort of fun, is one, sometimes God sends a gift, right? And that gift was Amit sitting next door to me. But the other thing I learned was that you can model things analytically in this new world in a way that I had never imagined. And that's been one of sort of the core values and theses of Google. And I think it's also a core value today for all of us and everyone here. Jonathan?
My moment was different. I had actually done a bunch of the things that you put in your nice video up there at eWorld and at Excite at Home, the now defunct Excite at Home, actually. And I developed what I thought was a lot of expertise in product management. That's That's why I was hired. I was the adult supervision for product management. And traditional product management that you learn in business school is really kind of this very structured gate-based thing where there's concept phases and investigation phases and then development. And at each of these gates, the company releases more money and you move through the product cycle and you increase your investment. And so I thought, well, I'll show them how good I am at this. I'll produce the mother of all product plans and business plans and I'll give it to Larry. So I did. And it was complete with all of the requisite charts and information, and it looked beautiful, and it had great vision. And I hand it to Larry, and he gets to like the 3rd page, and he just looks at me and sort of very quietly says, "No." And I'm like, "Larry, this is how we do product planning." And he says, "You know, when did you ever develop a product this way where the engineers put features into the product that weren't in that plan?" Well, I guess never. He says, "And that pretty Gantt, you call that a Gantt chart? Is that what it is?" I said, "Yes." He says, "When did they ever beat the schedule?" And I said, "Oh, well, they never beat the schedule." He says, "Well, then why do you even do it? That's stupid." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's what I do." So he then said, I then asked him what to do. And he said, "Well, just go sit with the engineers and talk to them about your vision for what we need to accomplish here and work with them."
Right after this, I had I managed to put the engineering leadership together, and I sort of gave a summary to the 2 founders. And Larry said, "None of what you just said is true." And I said, "How do you know?" Sort of an obnoxious back. He said, "I've been reading the snippets." And what had happened was that we had organized the company so that each engineer every week would say roughly what they were working on. And the management did not accurately represent to me what the engineers were working on. Interesting. So what did we do? We got rid of every manager in engineering. We called it the disorg. We didn't do a reorg, we did a disorg. And this poor, unfortunate executive who was left had 120 direct reports. It worked very well.
It actually wasn't a report that was created by humans. It was just a set of emails that were concatenated. And they were beautiful in their simplicity. All it did was say a few lines for every person, what I did this week, what I'm going to do next week. And if what you were going to do next week was go skiing to Tahoe, it said, "Gone, skiing in Tahoe." People would know you wouldn't be there.
You know, please don't take this down. This is not a good mark.
We're trying to give very specific management advice for the Cleveland Clinic.
So, Eric, you talked a little bit. I want to read one of your quotes back to you here. You said, "A lot of Google interventions come from engineers just screwing around with ideas. And then management would see them and say, 'Boy, that's interesting. Let's add some more engineers.'" Is that the way you organized the place? It sounds to me like you might have organized it a little bit more, and this might have been just a tad of understatement about what happens.
Well, first place, we want to distinguish between the marketing and the reality a little bit. One of the things that we did early on was we put in a normal management, for example, for the finances. And the sales teams were managed normally. So what we would do is bring people in and we would take them to the lava lamp rooms where all the lava lamps are running. Yeah. And we say, "Observe engineers doing creative things." The other part of the company, which looked normal, which we needed, because we didn't know how to do it in a crazy way, we actually had. But the core thing that we did do is we allowed people to sort of set very high goals. And one of the sort of problems with corporations is that they set low goals. Jonathan likes to say that instead of saying being 10% better, why don't you be 10 times better? Now the problem is that it's very difficult to hit 10 times better. So if you end up being 3 times better, and in the culture that's failure, then you've missed the entire goaling structure. So we put in place a structure where we would set goals, and if you got to roughly 70% of them, that was an A. And you could never do that in a normal situation.
Astro Teller, who works for us, says that imagine you're given a goal to build a new car. And somebody says, build a car that gets 70 miles per gallon. That's a project. But if they say, build a car that gets 500 miles to the gallon, that's a completely different project. You may not actually build a car that gets 500 miles per gallon if that's your objective, but it's probably going to be okay if you fail, and you'll probably come up with something fundamentally new that nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, and using that as an example, by the way, I actually did a whole study on this. If you want to get into the hundreds of miles a gallon, you have to change the weight of cars. And the only way to change the weight of cars is to invent completely new materials. Right? So again, it leads to a completely different conversation than you would have by saying, hey, let's just make the engine more efficient.
But by the way, there really is a lot of examples where management isn't dictating what goes on at Google. And the reason is that today, it's fundamentally much easier for engineers to prototype and to build demos. So it really is the case that the dynamic is often we get into a room, an engineer's excited about something, he or she created a prototype, they've showed it to their peers, and people are excited about it. That's a much more common way for something to evolve at Google, as opposed to someone like Eric or me having an idea and telling somebody to work on it.
And for many, many years, the way the company worked is we would have these sessions on Tuesdays where people, which were called Google Product Strategy meetings, where anybody could bring their ideas. And they were always like a mess. We were always running late, they were always complicated, but as a result, we kept seeing all these new ideas coming through. And I think that ultimately is how we systematized innovation. My favorite example, there are plenty of examples of this, my favorite example is that an employee had figured out that if he took his phone and he could take the other people's phone's location, he could not only know where his friends were, but he could predict where they were going in real time. So he presents this, he's all like 22 or 23. And I'm sitting at the other end of the table and I go, oh my God, you've invented this. And I have this ashen face. And he thinks it's praise. Now, I'm just sitting there doing in my math, the lawsuits, the privacy issues, and so forth. So Larry and Sergey picked up on this and decided that this was the best invention ever made. So all of a sudden, I've got a disaster on my hands because I've got the founders who are very important, very powerful, and they're saying to this 22-year-old, you're like God, right? And I've got this sort of privacy and legal disaster on my hands. So we ultimately solved this problem by allowing you to restate where you were so that you weren't really there.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sergey parked himself kite surfing just off the Dumbarton Bridge for a week. In Google Latitude, not really in the bay.
So I think that brings up an interesting point. So you've got three very bright, very talented, very creative personalities. How the hell you run the company?
We did okay.
I recognize that. I'm trying to take lessons from that.
I think in tech, if you look at success, we always pick a specific icon. And these are often very impressive people, but in fact, a relatively small team works together to make these tech companies. And I suspect this is true in other businesses as well. So when I was added as a member of the management team, I knew this. I knew I'd be working with brilliant young founders. So I set myself out to sort of organize things and to fill in the gaps. It's their company, it's their ideas, and frankly, their ideas were better than mine. And that structure worked pretty well. A classic example would be that the two of them would have some argument. We'd be sitting in one of these product strategy meetings, and there'd be some very important decision. I remember one which involved the primacy of the browser. Today Chrome is very successful, and if you're not using Chrome, you should. It's free, it makes things faster, it's the most stable platform, please use Chrome, it works on every platform, blah, blah, blah.
Who does it?
It's a free product from Google.
Oh.
Chrome.google.com. If you're not using Chrome, Toby, and if
I am.
Okay, good.
Just saying.
And do you care about safety and security? You should be using, in the medical world, you guys should all be using Chrome.
Well,
but I digress.
You digress. So
we're having this debate, and it's a fundamental strategic disagreement between Larry and Sergey and myself. So I, at that point, kicked everyone else out of the room and then we continued our argument. And then I said, look, guys, we do not agree. So by tomorrow at noon, I want you, the two of you, to make a decision, and I'll agree with whichever one you agree. In other words, I give up. You two fight it out, which is usually the best answer, right? So at noon, I show up in their office, and they've come up with a completely new approach that was much better than the one the day before. And so what I learned was sometimes in these organizations, if you sort of get the right people in the room and you just have it out, does this make any sense? And you push people hard, you get exceptional ideas. And there are plenty of examples like that.
You know, I think you make a really good point in the book when you talk about how you lead meetings and how you have discussions. Do you want to expand on?
Sure.
Well, we have our list of 10 ways to run a
do,
meeting.
and what we've discovered is most of what people like in the book are the rules, right? 10 ways to run a meeting, 10 ways to do your email.
No, that wasn't that.
The information that we have on meetings really, to me, strikes me as common sense, but what's astonishing is that most people don't actually do it. Most people don't have a very clear owner. The owner isn't typically the most senior person in the room who needs to run the meeting. The most senior person typically doesn't take the minutes. The most senior person doesn't typically think thoughtfully about who should be in the room and limit the number of the people in the room to some reasonable number. People create standing meetings and then expect everybody to go all the time, which is a complete waste of time when you add up the combinations of man-hours that are there. And then they don't take good minutes. So people are afraid to miss the meeting because they're going to miss the content, and that makes them feel like they're forced to go. So just the basics of the mechanics of forcing that every day and forcing the most senior person to do it makes an enormous difference. You get fewer meetings and you get far less wasted time.
You'd be amazed how much meeting hygiene, right, sort of literally running the meetings more efficiently improves productivity in general, because that's what managers do. We did have one massive management failure, which was my problem. I announced that we should have a meeting, which was the management meeting of the company, that would be 1 hour long per week. So I figured that everybody can put up with 1 hour. And I further decreed that you couldn't be doing email during the 60 minutes. So we would police this by, I would yell at people. So eventually Jonathan would take his then mobile device and do it under the table. It's called the prayer, you know, sort of praying like this, you know. What are you doing, Jonathan? Right, so then we would have other people would call him out and so forth. And eventually I discovered that you can't, at Google, get people to go offline for a face-to-face conversation. It's shocking to me that you're also not doing your email at the same time you're interviewing us.
But he did manage to institute one rule related to meetings, which I actually found to be torture at the time, but worked pretty well, which is the only thing executives actually control is the calendar. So when we would have a crisis, Eric would just say, oh, we're having a crisis. We're going to have a daily meeting on this. And we'd actually have a daily meeting.
I used to give this speech that if you guys can't resolve this, I'll have a weekly meeting. And if that doesn't work, we'll have a daily meeting. And if that doesn't work, we're going to have an hourly meeting. And we had a crisis where, and do you remember the name of it? It was the first transition when we went to the new database. And no one quite understood what the database transition was, and this drove the Drano meeting. And they had done the conversion over the weekend. It was very strange because in my previous life, I had always gone to the data center to see these conversions. But at Google, no one ever visited the data centers because the data centers are out in the cloud somewhere. So people are just sort of sitting around. And I came in on Monday, and of course, nothing's working. And so we, in fact, did this daily meeting thing. And within a week, we got it fixed. This precedent has been used many times. If you follow the ACA healthcare debacle with respect to signups, they not only did they do daily meetings, but they did standing daily meetings, and standing meaning standing up, not standing on your calendar, and it worked.
You know, there's some people here I know who would like to come to work for Google. How do you select people if they're going to want to work for Google?
We detail the attributes in the book. I mean, certainly the things most people are familiar with: cognitive knowledge, role-related knowledge. But what I really focus on is passion. You can't teach passion, and what I found is you can teach just about everything else if a person is smart. But if the person lacks passion, they're not going to have the kind of curiosity for attacking big problems and big challenges. So passion and curiosity are, for me, the #1 thing. As long as the person passes the requisite CAT scan that reveals signs of electrical activity. Is that what you guys do? You're like, ooh, he's very googly, right?
Ah, there's a word.
That's when you put us in that machine.
Googly. Do you have a googly machine to check googliness?
Well, checking googliness really is what we do in interviews, right? And what we're looking for is to find that passion. We're looking to find if they pass what we call the LAX test, right? Like, I've been stuck in the equivalent of LAX
the LAX
for
test
like
is
8
really,
days.
Everyone here will understand this. You're stuck in the LAX airport for 6 hours. At the end of the 6 hours, are you still interested in talking to this person or not? This is a very tough test.
That's a tough one.
It's a very tough test.
Now, speaking of interviews, you had an interesting interview when you came to Google. And I'll bet, you only get part of it in the book, but I think there's a lot of bachelors here who'd like to know the whole outcome of that.
Well, yeah, I told the 10-second version on the Today Show. I'll tell the slightly longer version. So I get to my interview, and again, I come in thinking I'm a big shot, right? Because I'm in a big job, and this is like a small little company. This was actually 2 years before Eric hired me, so Larry and Sergey were 2 years younger. And I come in, and Sergey interviews me, and he asks a bunch of questions, and I think I do okay. And then he sort of just sits back, and he says, "Explain to me something complicated that I don't know." And he points at the whiteboard, and I'm like, well, I sort of remember bubble sort. Maybe I could do that in BASIC with a double 4-next loop and figure something out. And then I think, that's probably not a good idea. Something he doesn't know. Okay, economics. So I start pulling up my economics memory, and an average cost states that marginal cost biceps average cost at the latter's minimum, set up a cost function q of x over x, take the first derivative, q prime of x marginal cost equals average cost, which is q of x over x, and I'm very proud of myself. And Sergey's like, this is elementary college calculus. I was a math Olympian. And so I look at him, and he's in his torn jeans, and I think, oh, I will switch gears. Mr. Brin, I shall teach you courtship. And I got up at the board and I said, chapter 1, dangling the hook. And I started to tell him the story that before I met my wife, somebody told me that there was this nice Jewish girl who was dating somebody else at Watkins Johnson, and that I should meet her. And I said, well, give me her address. I'll send her flowers. And I sent her flowers and a puzzle. And from there, I launched into my explanation to Sergey of courtship. And he seemed quite satisfied and interested.
I bet there's some more chapters we'd like to hear for another day.
Guys, you can see me afterwards.
So, back to the people, the type of people that you hire. You refer to them as smart creatives, and you sort them through. But not just on Googliness, but how many do you have a year? How many applicants?
Laszlo has a book coming out called Work Rules, but it was 50,000 per something.
It's at least 1,000 per job. I mean, it's
1,000 per job.
Yeah, it's at least. We have an enormous inflow, and the good news is we use computers to do the initial weeding.
And how many meetings interviews does a person go through?
Well, we had this unfortunate case of this gentleman that we interviewed 16 times. And
must have been a big job.
No, it wasn't.
And I think we rejected him.
And at the end of the 16th time, the consensus was to reject him, which I thought was like seriously cruel. And so I asked.
How did he feel about that?
I was careful not to call him. It was just a serious error on our part. And so I asked Jonathan and Laszlo to kind of figure out the math. And it turns out that you can probabilistically compute whether somebody's going to be successful at Google or not with 5 interviews.
Really?
And so we initially set the rule at 8, which is a random number that I made, which was half of 16. And now we've actually proved that it's 5. So it turns out that if you do recruiting right, you can do it very efficiently. And again, I think, using Cleveland Clinic as an example, you all are hiring a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And even if you're not growing, which in your case you are, but the average company isn't growing that much, they're still replacing quite a few employees for retirement or job change or what have you. So you could begin to use these principles everywhere. We identify with the smart creatives at least sort of 3 components. One is some kind of technological or analytical capability. In medicine, that's obvious, right? Because it's a highly technical field. Anyone who's in the medical community is skilled at a specific thing that matters a lot to life care. Another one is some kind of business acumen. They're interested in business. They like being in business. They want to make money or have an impact. And the third one is curiosity. And so if you can, in a few interviews, ascertain that, then the rest of it, the resume and so forth, is quite predictive.
And, so how do you keep them there? You say you exile the knaves, but fight for the divas.
Yeah.
What the heck does that mean?
A lot of people have picked up on that. We tend to have people work in very small teams in close proximity to each other. And that creates kind of built-in social controls and dynamics. And you want to get rid of knaves quickly and brutally. I define a knave as someone who lies, someone who cheats, someone who steals, someone who takes credit for somebody else's work. Because if you get too much of a tipping point in knave density, then everybody's miserable. So the social dynamic, along with the help from the manager, exiles the knaves. But the same social dynamic can drive out the people who we call divas. A diva is the kind of person who exhibits high exceptionalism and is extremely demanding and sometimes difficult to work with. So you need to identify those difficult people who are actually brilliant and doing a good job and make sure they don't get driven out. Exile knaves, fight for divas.
So where do you put the divas? Do you have a diva room that you isolate?
No. They have to stay with the...
But I think part of it is that as much as I would like the world to be kumbaya, where we're all best friends, we're all even and so forth, human ability is not uniformly distributed. And there are people who are exceptional and also difficult. Perhaps this is true in medicine.
Oh, occasionally.
Perhaps I'll let you speak to that subject. But those people, if they're honest, hardworking, principled, are enormously valuable. So the executives need to protect them to the point where they can get their job done and they can lead. And I'm not arguing for arrogance, because I think arrogance sort of comes with the package, and obviously we don't have to be too arrogant, and our industry is certainly accused of arrogance correctly. But the fact of the matter is it takes that energy to drive human systems forward, right? We are going to solve this problem. I'm going to invent this. We are going to do this together, right? All of those skills require this sort of diva-ish behavior.
So in 2004, in your IPO letter, you wrote about don't be evil. And I think that's perplexed a lot of people as a sort of a statement for a corporation. Sort of tell us, how you think that applies to all the things that you're going through right now in terms of, privacy, et cetera.
Well, first place, it sets a pretty high standard, and we knew we were doing that. But the real reason that Don't Be Evil exists is an internal control mechanism. So, again, in my first year, I'm assuming this is some marketing crap, right? Because they give you the sort of sayings of a company when you join. And this had been around before I showed up. And I'm sitting in a room, and there's a presentation on a certain kind of mixing of ads and our normal results. And one of the engineers, his name is Ron, sits there, listens to this for all, and pounds his hand on the table and says, "That's evil." The entire conversation stopped, and there was this sort of 45-minute, literally, argument on whether this was evil or not, and we stopped it. And I'm sitting there going like, oh my God. And I realized that this principle is a way of internal judgment. Since there's no book that codifies evil in a tactical sense. There are in a religious sense, but not in a tactical sense. That you need to have permission to have the conversation. And so this principle guided almost all of the decisions that we made. And the other principle, which again Jonathan promoted a great deal, is we make decisions based on end users. Right? So if you're doing something which is not about an end user and really about something else, you're in that kind of maybe evil territory, and you're going to get called out. And that's, in my view, served us well. So when as you know, because you and I have been friends for a long time, my sort of current job is largely dealing with other people who would regulate, compete with, or otherwise affect Google. Sometimes welcome, sometimes not. But I always start by saying, we made this decision because it made the end users happier. Right? We're solving for the end user outcome.
Right.
And that's a pretty good starting point for a conversation, as opposed to we did it for earnings or revenue or shareholders.
And how do you perpetuate that from a small group like you had all the way across 40-some thousand people all over the world?
Well, we're much more open and aggressive and transparent with communication. And one of the things that has surprised me as I sort of look at the management literature is most companies are not nearly as aggressive with email, with their own corporate website and internal website, intranet, and sharing information with their employees. One of the things that Eric has championed, which I remember because I did all the board slides for him for 9 years, is every time he presents to the board, a few weeks later, he presents the exact same set of slides to the employees.
And we do this today, by the way.
All the employees. Right. Now he does it via a video conference. So I think accepting that you've got ubiquitous information available if you produce it to people is very powerful, and yet most companies grew up in this traditional approach to decision making and information management where it's sort of siloed and it flows down only to the subset of people who need to know it.
And these silos, by the way, are horrific, and they exist in all forms of medicine, universities, the government, big corporations. And they ultimately cause people to have very narrow goals, right? I'm trying to solve this problem. And these are honest people trying to do a good job. We argue very strongly in the book, as you know, that you should hire generalists and you should form teams that cross functions to try to solve new problems. So again, you got to do it all. You got to hire the really smart people. You've got to give them creative permission. You've got to set very high goals, and you have to communicate with them, right, in both directions. As an example, tomorrow morning in California, we're having the equivalent of this talk internally. And Google has an internal message board called Dory, where the employees submit questions and they rank them, and we're required to go from top, and the ranking changes during the meeting. So it's as though we're being judged by every answer, and oh, you didn't answer this question, and boom, and so forth. And you know, you were required to operate that way. I personally prefer sort of normal human interaction, but this is how it works.
Normal humans or just interaction?
Normal. But it's a good example of how you can use tools to affect a culture of challenge and openness that really does benefit.
Let me ask you, what does Google know about us?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, but let's assume that you haven't done anything unusual with respect to your settings. Boring. You're boring. I cannot imagine this to be true. So the normal situation would be that your queries are retained for approximately 18 months, and then they're anonymized. So during that time, to give you a technical answer, if the police, for example, gave us a lawful subpoena, which they do occasionally, but not in your case, we would give that kind of information out. And they're typically looking for criminal intent. And that seems like a reasonable compromise between the interests of society and so forth. If you don't like that, Google now gives you a privacy panel, which you can look up on Google using your favorite search engine, which will allow you to delete all of this information. And indeed, you can use Google in such a way, it's called incognito mode, that no information is ever retained about you. So what we tried to do with this privacy concern is we tried to say our default is a reasonable compromise, and most people are very law-abiding and mean well and so forth. But if you have some special concern over this, we give you the tools to decide where you are.
And what about the right to be forgotten?
Well, as you know, I spent much of my summer working on this. In June, we lost a court case in Spain, which went to the Luxembourg, the equivalent of Europe's Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court in June ruled that Google was required to do the following, and this is the law. If you're not a public figure, and if the information is not of material public interest, and if you submit a request to Google, Google is required to review that request, and if it meets those criteria, remove it from Google. Pretty interesting. The initial case was of a Spanish person who 20 years earlier had failed to pay his taxes on his housing, which is apparently a common problem. And so he was found guilty, and he wanted that history erased for some current rule. Google doesn't like this rule at all. It's probably not a rule that would be acceptable in the United States. And we are now leading hearings in Europe, which I'm driving personally, to try to understand how to handle the ambiguous cases. And without going into the details, each and every one of you can imagine all sorts of complicated cases where the right to know is in conflict with the right to be forgotten.
And we're also we don't remove it from the source. We're removing it from Google. So if the article was in the London Times or something, it still exists in the London Times.
Right.
It just doesn't exist in Google.
Let me just ask you a few final questions, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. Give me your view of what we're going to look like 5 years from now as a world.
I think fundamentally the biggest change is going to be that if you look at the rates of adoption of phones, we've got 2.5 billion additional people who are going to get access to smartphones. And when you think about what that means for them relative to what it meant for us, many of these people in the developed world don't have access to a library. They don't get a newspaper. They don't know how their government operates. They don't know about crop rotation. They don't have directions to build a well. They can't send their doctor, they don't have a doctor, but they can't send a doctor a picture when they have some type of problem and get help. So I think fundamentally the biggest thing that's going to happen is those people are going to come online. It's going to completely transform their lives, and they're also going to join the online medium and participate in discussions online with all of us.
I think one of the biggest things in the developed world will be the transformation of medicine from the non-invasive monitoring technologies that are being developed to be connected to phones. The Cleveland Clinic has been doing a number of activities in there. You've participated in them. Some of your teams have as well. It goes something like this. Your phone is highly personal. This is obviously opt-in, HIPAA compliant, with your permission, all that kind of stuff. But the non-invasive monitoring, transdermal patches, Wi-Fi out the condition of certain blood situations, et cetera. Literally your phone, the theory is the phone will call the doctor and the phone will text you and say, you're about to die, go to the hospital. And it'll call the hospital and say, he's coming, and he's coming in 10 minutes because I scared the crap out of him, right? And that whole cycle, right, in all sorts of variants will really change the way patient care works here. But there's more. It's probable that your use of a phone and so forth might be an early detector of Alzheimer's. There is some evidence that changes in personal patterns and phone use might be used, for example, to alert a psychiatrist that somebody was depressed and so forth and so on. The app that I want is, how's my mom doing? And older people tend to be an established pattern. When her pattern changes, right, I want an alert of call your mom, which is probably do it randomly anyway. But you see what I'm saying is that this notion of knowing what's going on with the patient when the patient is healthy, and then the alerts as things change, will change medicine forever.
It's subtle, but if you imagine as a doctor, a patient comes in and sees you, and you just have one data point, that moment in time. But if you go back to some of these examples, the psychologist who, with the permission of the parents and everything, has access to a teenager who might be at risk in some ways, phone. They're making fewer calls. They're not getting up in the morning. They're not leaving the house. They're not returning their texts. That's enormously powerful information, far greater than what the psychologist is going to get when they ask the teenager, so how you doing? And the kid sits there or gives, a one-syllable answer.
So let me ask you guys sort of a personal question. What's next? What are you going to be doing 5 years from now?
Well, I think we're going to be doing the same thing.
We've
been working on the same.
Book tour?
We've been doing the same thing.
Book tour number 2?
I think we've been doing this for about 20 years in one way or the other. The promise of these platforms and the connectivity of the world and its impact is what I've chosen to do in my life. I'm enormously proud of the impact that we've had by building these networks and getting the world together. The good news and the bad news is we now know what's going on, right? And I'm a fundamental believer that human society is good, that the right voices will appear, that we will address the challenges that we've always been there, but now we know about through good governance, good conversations, and better technology.
Hanging out with Eric has worked for me. If he's hanging out for the next 5 to 10 years, I'll hang out with him.
Please welcome Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg.
That was way too nice.
Thank you. I could watch that again.
Well, we can.
I'd rather talk about your success over the last decade running the Cleveland Clinic.
Well, thanks. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks like it's
you're on the hot spot tonight. I'm
really
sorry.
well, Toby.
You're the largest employer in Ohio.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it?
And you managed to fund all this from operations. You're going to change education for doctors, the expansion of the impact on the Midwest. And now you're global.
And we do Windows.
And you're googly. You do things free. Free is a good price.
We do that. Here they all are.
They're all here for free.
Yeah. Well, listen, I want you to know
about it, and you're never here. Now, it occurred
this
to me...
gives me a pause, by the way, for tomorrow morning.
So at this point, I realized that there's no possible thing I can now say. Anything I say is like bad, like get out of my office, or who the hell are you, or one of those things. So I had no choice but to sit down at my desk next to him.
How'd you guys get on?
Well, it was interesting that he's an engineer, and so he didn't say anything, and he was programming, and he had his headphones on, so I didn't have to talk to him at all. So about a month later, I'm talking to 2 months later, I'm talking to Omid, who's running sales. And, and I'm having this conversation, and it's, look, I think the number needs to be higher. And he says, no, it's a stretch goal. We're trying to get to 120, referring to $1 million of revenue. And I said, I'm sure that you can do higher. I mean, I've been looking at the growth rates.
That I can see I got a control problem here today. This is not like the operating room.
I've known you for a decade, and I've known him for 13.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, one more compliment. We were observing that we're in the medical community, and the great thing about doctors is that they start on time and they own the outcome.
Well,
right? So for those of you, it's actually like really hard to do. It's very impressive, all of you.
Thank you. I had the nice opportunity to read your book all the way through over this last weekend. And I want to tell you, all of you, if you haven't bought it, this is a plug. This is the advertising that pays for their trip. That it is a very worthwhile read. I sat down and read it straight through one read. And I want to thank you. And I realize that both of you were really seasoned executives. And you came from different organizations. When did you realize that you weren't in Kansas anymore?
There were a lot of early signs, but I think we missed them. I think for me, I showed up, and I'm kind of figuring it out, and the company is very small. And maybe a month or two after I started, I come into work, and I have a tiny little office, an 8-foot by 12-foot office, and there's a person in it who's working. He's moved his desk in, and I said, hello. He said, hello, I'm Amit. And I roughly said, what are you doing here?
How did you say it?
Like, roughly, in a nice way. I was like shocked. And he said, I've moved in. And I said, okay. And he said, well, and I paused, and he said, well, my office is over there, and it's really, really crowded. Yeah, we're going to try for 122. I click up the phone, and he takes his headphones off and says, do you need to know the revenue number? I said, I knew you were listening in on all my conversations. I knew it. I knew you were sitting here listening. So it turns out that his job was to model revenue in the analytics department. So I never told anyone, and I just tortured the salespeople because I had the scientist next to me.
Right.
So what I learned a bit from this, aside from being just sort of fun, is one, sometimes God sends a gift, right? And that gift was Amit sitting next door to me. But the other thing I learned was that you can model things analytically in this new world in a way that I had never imagined. And that's been one of sort of the core values and theses of Google. And I think it's also a core value today for all of us and everyone here. Jonathan?
My moment was different.